I avoided phone calls for years because of English narrator Daniel. I never ignored people. I ignored phone calls, not messages, not emails, only phone calls. Every time my phone rang, my chest tightened before my mind could react. Unknown number, office number, international call. I watched the screen light up. I waited. I let it stop ringing. Then I told myself I would call back later. I never did. For years, people thought I was careless. Some thought I was unprofessional. Some thought I simply didn't care. No one knew the truth. I wasn't lazy. I wasn't rude. I was terrified of speaking English with no face, no pause, no second chance, and one call I avoided didn't just ring and disappear. It changed my life. Segment 1. Narrator Daniel. My fear of phone calls did not begin with English. It began with control, or rather, the lack of it. When you speak face to face, you can read expressions. You can slow down. You can repeat yourself naturally. But on a phone call, your voice stands alone. And my voice carried an accent. The first time I panicked during a phone call was years ago. I was asked a simple question, something I understood clearly, but the voice on the other end spoke fast, too fast. My mind tried to translate, my mouth tried to respond, and everything froze. I said sorry 3 times in one sentence. I asked them to repeat, then repeat again. The call ended politely, but my hands were shaking. That moment followed me. After that, every phone call felt like a test I would fail before it even started. I began avoiding them quietly. I let calls ring. I told myself I was busy. I chose texting over talking every time. At first, it felt like a smart solution. Then it became a habit. Phone calls represent urgency, authority, judgment. On a call, you cannot hide your hesitation behind a smile or a nod, and I was afraid my accent would betray me before my words did. Each missed call added to the fear. Each avoided conversation made the next one harder. I started rehearsing imaginary phone calls in my head. Full conversations that never happened, perfect answers I never used. I prepared for calls I never answered. People noticed. I received messages asking why I never picked up. Some were patient, some were frustrated. I gave vague excuses, network issues, missed calls, busy schedules. The truth was simpler. English on the phone made me feel exposed. At work and in school, this fear began costing me things, opportunities, trust, sometimes respect. I missed important information. I delayed responses. I depended on others to speak for me. And each time I told myself it was temporary. I'll answer the next one. I just need more confidence. I just need better English. But confidence doesn't arrive when you hide. One evening, my phone rang again. An unfamiliar number. I stared at it longer than usual. My heart raced. My finger hovered over the screen. I didn't answer. A few minutes later, a message arrived. We tried calling you. Please call back as soon as possible. That message carried weight. More than fear, more than anxiety, it carried consequence. And that was the moment I realized something uncomfortable. Avoiding phone calls wasn't protecting me anymore. It was shrinking my world. The call I feared most was coming, and I would not be able to ignore it. Segment 2. Narrator Daniel. The message stayed on my screen longer than it should have. We tried calling you. Please call back as soon as possible. The words felt heavier than a missed call notification. They felt final, urgent, unavoidable. I placed the phone face down on the table as if that could silence the demand it carried. My heart was already racing, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew how this would go. Fast English, unfamiliar voices, questions I would need to answer immediately. No time to prepare, no time to translate, no way to hide. I told myself I would call back in a few minutes. I always did. But minutes passed, then an hour, then another. The phone stayed silent. But my thoughts did not. I imagined the conversation again and again, every possible opening line, every possible misunderstanding. I practiced answers quietly. I imagined myself asking them to repeat. I imagined the awkward pauses, the frustration on the other end. The longer I waited, the harder it became to dial. That was the cruel part of avoidance. Each delay strengthened the fear. Each missed moment made the next one feel bigger. Finally, as the sky outside grew darker, I picked up the phone. My hands were cold. My throat felt tight. I stared at the number for a long time. Then I pressed call. The ringing felt louder than usual. One ring, two. Someone answered. Hello. The voice was calm, professional, but fast. Faster than I expected. My mind scrambled to keep up. I caught some words, missed others. I focused on the tone, trying to understand the intention even when the details slipped past me. I introduced myself. My voice sounded unfamiliar to my own ears. Slightly higher, tense. The accent I had spent years trying to soften stood out clearly. I apologized without thinking. Sorry, could you repeat that? The person did not react negatively. They repeated themselves slower this time. I listened carefully. I answered as clearly as I could. My sentences were short, direct, simple. The conversation moved forward. It wasn't smooth. I asked for clarification twice. I paused once to think, but nothing broke. No one became impatient. No one laughed. No one rushed me. When the call ended, I sat there in silence, phone still in my hand. It was over. The fear I had carried for years had lasted 6 minutes, and nothing terrible happened. That realization was disorienting. I felt relieved, yes, but also confused. If phone calls weren't as dangerous as I believed, why had I avoided them for so long? The answer was uncomfortable. I had been preparing for judgment that never arrived. In the days that followed, I noticed something else. Because I had avoided phone calls, people had filled the silence with their own assumptions. They assumed I was unreliable. They assumed I was uninterested. They assumed I didn't care enough to respond quickly. My fear had spoken for me. I began to see how avoidance communicates a message. Even when you say nothing, silence tells a story. And often it is not the one you want told. The next phone call came unexpectedly. Another unknown number. My body reacted before my mind, tight chest, shallow breath. But this time I recognized the feeling. It was fear, not danger. I answered. The conversation was short, unimportant, but when it ended, something shifted. I had broken a pattern, a small one, but real. Over the next few weeks, I forced myself to answer calls I would normally ignore. Not all of them, not perfectly, but more often than before. Each call felt uncomfortable. Each one ended without disaster. I learned something practical during this time. Phone calls are not about perfect English. They are about intention. When I slowed down, when I chose simple words, when I asked for repetition without apologizing excessively, conversations flowed more easily. People adjusted naturally. They wanted to be understood as much as I did. One evening, I realized I had stopped rehearsing imaginary phone calls. The conversations in my head faded. Reality became less threatening than imagination. But there was still one call I feared more than any other, a call I had postponed for months, a call that could not be avoided much longer. And when that call finally came, it would test everything I thought I had learned. Segment 3. Narrator Daniel. There was one phone call I avoided longer than all the others. Not because it was urgent, not because it was difficult, but because it mattered. It was a call related to an opportunity I wanted, something that could change my routine, maybe even my future. The email had been sitting in my inbox for months. Polite, short, clear. Please call us to discuss next steps. I read it again and again. Every time my chest tightened. I imagined the conversation turning fast. I imagined missing an important detail. I imagined embarrassing myself in the very moment I wanted to make a good impression. So I delayed. Days became weeks, weeks became months. I convinced myself the opportunity would still be there when my English improved, when my confidence grew, when my fear faded. None of those things happened. Then one afternoon, my phone rang. The number was familiar, the same one I had avoided dialing for months. My body reacted instantly, my heart raced, my fingers went cold. I stared at the screen. This time I didn't let it ring. I answered. Hello! The voice on the other end was calm, friendly, not rushed. They explained why they were calling. I listened carefully. I focused on understanding the meaning, not every word. When something was unclear, I asked them to repeat. Once, then again. I did not apologize. That small change mattered. As the conversation continued, I realized something surprising. They were not testing my English. They were trying to understand my experience, my thoughts, my availability. They asked questions I answered honestly, slowly, with pauses. My accent was present, my fear was present too, but neither controlled the conversation. Halfway through the call, my breathing slowed, my voice steadied. I stopped monitoring myself and started listening. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was proud. Not proud that I sounded fluent, proud that I showed up. A few days later, I received a follow-up message. They thanked me for the conversation and moved the process forward. The opportunity had not disappeared. It had simply waited, but I almost lost it. That realization stayed with me. Fear doesn't always say no. Sometimes it says later, and later quietly becomes never. After that call, I stopped pretending phone calls were optional. They were part of life, part of communication, part of being present in the world. I still felt nervous. I still preferred messages, but I no longer allowed fear to decide for me automatically. One evening, I received a call from a friend. In the past, I would have let it ring and replied with a message later. That night, I answered. We talked, not about anything important, just small things, laughter, pauses, repetition. It felt human. I began to notice how phone calls force you to trust your voice. There is no visual support, no chance to hide behind expressions, but there is something honest about that. Your words matter, your tone matters, and people respond to intention more than perfection. Slowly, I started seeing phone calls differently, not as traps, but as conversations that required presence. The fear did not vanish completely. Some calls were still harder than others. Some voices were still fast. Some accents were still difficult for me to understand. But now those moments felt manageable. I had learned something important. You don't fail a phone call by asking for repetition. You fail it by not answering. The biggest cost of avoiding calls was not embarrassment, it was absence. That truth prepared me for the final shift, the moment when phone calls stopped being something I survived and became something I could use. Not confidently, but honestly. And that shift would change how I saw my own voice forever. Segment 4. Narrator Daniel. After that call, phone calls stopped feeling like emergencies. They still made me uncomfortable, but the panic was no longer in control. I began to see them as moments that required attention, not escape. That difference changed how I responded to the sound of my phone ringing. The next time it rang, I noticed my reaction clearly. My chest tightened, but I didn't freeze. I let the feeling exist without obeying it. That was new. I answered. The conversation was ordinary. Someone asking for information, a short exchange. It ended quickly. But something important happened during that call. I did not apologize once. I did not rush my words. I allowed pauses, and the person on the other end waited. I realized then how much of my fear came from assumptions. I assumed people would become impatient. I assumed they would judge my accent. I assumed I was wasting their time. But those assumptions had rarely been tested. They lived safely in my head. Once I began answering calls, reality began correcting those assumptions. People slowed down when I asked them to. They repeated information without frustration. They adjusted naturally. Phone calls are negotiations, not performances. Over the following weeks, I answered more calls. Not all of them, but enough to notice patterns. The calls I feared most were not the ones that went badly. They were the ones I imagined most vividly. Reality once again was quieter than fear. I also noticed how avoidance had shaped how others interacted with me. When I avoided calls, people stopped calling. They relied on messages. They excluded me from urgent decisions, not intentionally, practically. When I started answering, that changed. I was informed sooner, included earlier, trusted more. Not because my English improved dramatically, but because I was available. Availability builds confidence faster than fluency. One afternoon, I had to make a call instead of answering one. This was the kind of situation I still dreaded. Initiating a conversation meant no warm-up, no chance to ease into it. Just my voice entering someone else's space. I stared at the number for a while. Then I dialed. The call went exactly as expected. There were pauses. I asked for clarification. I repeated information to confirm understanding. Nothing went wrong. When I hung up, I felt something shift inside me. I had controlled the situation, not by speaking perfectly, but by staying present. That was when I began to trust my voice more than my fear. I stopped trying to sound fluent. I focused on being clear, simple sentences, natural pace, calm tone. This approach worked better than any pronunciation practice I had done alone. I began applying the same mindset outside phone calls, in meetings, in conversations, in moments where my accent used to trigger silence. The confidence I gained on the phone followed me everywhere. One evening, I reflected on how strange it was that something so small had held so much power over my life. Phone calls are ordinary. People make them every day. But fear can turn ordinary things into walls. Breaking that wall did not require bravery. It required repetition, answering one call, then another, then another. Confidence did not arrive in a rush. It arrived quietly, through consistency. I also learned to forgive myself for the years I spent avoiding calls. That avoidance had been a survival strategy. It had protected me when I didn't know how to cope. But survival was no longer enough. I wanted participation. The final lesson came unexpectedly. One night, I received a call from someone struggling with English. They apologized constantly. They spoke quickly, nervously. I recognized the fear immediately. I slowed the conversation. I reassured them. I listened patiently. And in that moment, I saw myself reflected clearly. My fear had turned into empathy. I realized then that my journey with phone calls was never just about English. It was about learning to trust myself in moments where I felt exposed. The phone no longer represented danger, it represented connection, and that understanding prepared me for the final stage. The moment where phone calls became something I used not just to communicate, but to help others feel less afraid. Segment 5. Narrator. Daniel. Helping someone else face a fear often reveals how far you have already traveled. I did not notice the change in myself until it was reflected back to me through another person's hesitation. The call came late in the evening. It was from a colleague I had worked with briefly. We usually communicated through messages, short, safe, predictable. When I saw his name on the screen, I hesitated for a moment. Then I answered. He sounded nervous immediately. His sentences were rushed. His apologies arrived before his questions. Sorry to bother you. Sorry if my English is not good. Sorry if this is a bad time. I recognized the pattern instantly. I had lived inside it for years. I slowed my voice. I told him it was okay. I asked him to take his time. The change was immediate. His breathing settled. His words came out more clearly, not because his English improved, but because the pressure eased. He explained that he needed to make an important call the next day, a professional one, and he was afraid of misunderstanding something critical, afraid of sounding incompetent, afraid of freezing the way he always did. He asked me how I manage phone calls now. The question caught me off guard. For years I would have said I avoided them, that they were too difficult, that my English was not good enough. But that night the answer was different. I told him the truth. I told him I still felt nervous sometimes. I told him I still asked people to repeat themselves. I told him my accent never disappeared. But I also told him something else. I told him phone calls stopped being scary when I stopped trying to sound perfect and started trying to be clear. We practiced together, not rehearsing perfect sentences, just simple exchanges, asking for clarification, confirming information, pausing without apologizing. He laughed nervously at first, then more naturally. The fear did not vanish, but it softened. Before we ended the call, he said something quietly. I didn't think I could do this, but now it feels possible. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long moment. That was when I realized something important. The skills I feared I didn't have had been growing quietly all along. Not pronunciation, not speed, not fluency, presence. The next day he messaged me after his call. It had gone well, not perfect, but successful. He understood what he needed. He communicated clearly. He survived. His relief was real. That message stayed with me. I thought about how many years I had believed my fear was a personal failure, something unique to me, something shameful. But fear is rarely unique. It is shared quietly by many people who think they are alone. Phone calls amplify that fear because they remove context. They force listening, they demand response, but they also teach something powerful. Trust. You learn to trust the other person to wait. You learn to trust yourself to ask. You learn to trust that misunderstanding is not the end of the conversation. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how differently I approach calls. I did not rush to answer everyone, but I no longer avoided them reflexively. I chose based on importance, not fear. I also noticed how my voice sounded different, not smoother, but steadier, less apologetic, less defensive. I spoke as if I expected to be understood, and often I was. One evening, I made a call that would have terrified me before, a formal one, structured, time sensitive. I prepared briefly, then dialed. The conversation flowed. There were pauses, clarifications, but also understanding. When it ended, I realized something had changed permanently. Phone calls were no longer events, they were conversations. That shift extended beyond the phone. It changed how I viewed communication itself. Speaking is not about delivering perfect sentences, it is about navigating meaning together. Fear isolates, communication connects. I had spent years protecting myself from embarrassment, but in doing so, I had also protected myself from growth. The phone calls I avoided were not threats, they were opportunities to practice presence. Helping someone else face that fear showed me how much I had learned, not from courses, not from drills, but from showing up repeatedly when it felt uncomfortable. My voice did not become fearless, it became reliable. And reliability matters more than confidence. The final stage of this journey was not about mastering phone calls. It was about understanding what fear had taken from me and what presence had given back. That realization would come in a quiet moment, one where I would finally stop measuring my English by how little fear I felt and start measuring it by how much I participated. Segment 6. Narrator Daniel. There is a moment in every long struggle when fear stops being loud and starts becoming familiar. That moment arrived quietly for me, not as confidence, not as courage, but as routine. Phone calls became part of my day. That sentence would have terrified me years ago. I did not suddenly enjoy them. I did not wake up excited to answer unknown numbers. But something important had changed. I no longer built my entire day around avoiding them. I no longer rearranged my life to stay unreachable. When my phone rang, I noticed the feeling, the tight chest, the quick breath, the pause before action. But instead of obeying it, I acknowledged it. Fear was present. That was all. I answered anyway. Over time, I noticed how my body reacted less dramatically. My hands stopped shaking. My voice stopped rising at the beginning of calls. My apologies disappeared almost completely. I spoke slower. I listened more carefully. I stopped trying to sound fluent and started trying to sound human. That shift changed everything. I realized that most phone calls are not tests. They are negotiations of understanding. People want clarity, not perfection. They want to finish the task, not judge your accent. Once I understood that, the pressure lifted. I also became better at something I had always feared, interrupting politely. In the past, I would let people speak quickly until I was completely lost. Now, I stop them gently. Sorry, can I confirm something? Could you say that part again more slowly? Let me repeat to make sure I understood. These sentences became tools instead of confessions. I used them without embarrassment, and people responded well, often with relief, because misunderstandings waste time for everyone. One afternoon, something happened that made me pause. I was on a call with someone who spoke very fast, native level speed, strong confidence. In the past, I would have blamed myself immediately for not keeping up. That day I noticed something different. They were unclear. They jumped between topics. They skipped details. They assumed knowledge I didn't have. For the first time, I saw that communication problems are not owned by one person. They are shared. I asked them to slow down. I asked them to clarify. The conversation improved. That moment shifted my internal balance. I stopped placing all responsibility on my English. Communication is a two-way process, and accents are only one small part of it. As this understanding settled in, my confidence grew in a quieter way. Not outwardly, inwardly. I trusted myself more. I trusted that I could handle confusion. I trusted that I could ask questions. I trusted that silence was no longer my only defense. Phone calls stopped being something I survived. They became something I navigated. This confidence began spilling into other areas of my life. In meetings, I spoke up sooner. In conversations, I asked questions without apology. I stopped rehearsing sentences in my head before speaking. I allowed myself to be imperfect in real time. The energy I saved was enormous. I did not realize how exhausting fear had been until it loosened its grip. One evening, while cleaning my inbox, I found old emails, missed calls, unanswered requests, opportunities I had postponed indefinitely. Reading them brought a quiet sadness, not regret, understanding. I forgave myself. Avoidance had been my way of coping when I didn't know how to face fear. It had protected me until I learned better tools. Now those tools were part of me. That forgiveness was necessary. Without it, growth feels like punishment. With it, growth feels like movement. The final test came unexpectedly, a call from someone important, not urgent, but meaningful. The kind of call that would have kept me awake at night before. When my phone rang, I felt the old tension rise. I answered. The conversation lasted longer than expected. There were complex points, decisions, clarifications. I asked questions. I repeated information. I took pauses without explaining myself. When the call ended, I felt something new. Not relief, readiness. I was ready for the next call and the one after that. That readiness did not mean fear was gone. It meant fear no longer decided for me. And that realization brought me to the final understanding of this journey. Phone calls were never the real problem. English was never the real problem. The real problem was believing that my voice needed to be perfect before it could be used. And once that belief dissolved, everything else followed. Segment 7. Narrator Daniel. When fear loses its grip, it does not disappear. It changes its shape. It becomes a reminder instead of a warning. By the time I reached that point, phone calls no longer felt like threats. They felt like moments that asked for presence. The clearest sign of that change came through someone else. A new team member joined our group. Quiet, polite, always messaging instead of calling. He responded quickly to texts, but avoided real-time conversations. At first, no one questioned it, but as responsibilities grew, the gap became noticeable. One afternoon, he sent a message asking if we could talk, not on the phone, just through text. He said it would be easier. I recognized the hesitation immediately. Instead of insisting, I suggested a short call, 5 minutes, nothing formal, just to clarify a few points. There was a pause. Then he agreed. When the call started, his voice was tight, his sentences rushed. Apologies appeared before questions. He repeated the same phrases I used to repeat years ago. Sorry, my English is not very good. Sorry, I'm nervous. I slowed the pace. I spoke calmly. I reassured him that clarity mattered more than speed. Gradually, his voice settled. The conversation became smoother. At the end of the call, he said something quietly. "That wasn't as bad as I thought." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. After we hung up, I realized something important. I was now on the other side of the fear, the side that creates safety. Fear isolates, safety invites. Over the next few weeks, he called more often, not confidently, but willingly. Each time he apologized less. Each time he spoke more clearly, and no one judged him for it. Watching that process unfold confirmed something I had begun to understand. The most powerful thing you can do with your voice is make space for someone else's. My own relationship with phone calls continued to evolve. I stopped categorizing them as good or bad. They became neutral tools. Some were easy, some were still uncomfortable, but none felt impossible. I also became more aware of how often people avoid real time communication without realizing the cost. Messages delay understanding. Silence creates assumptions. Calls, even imperfect ones, move things forward. One evening, a call came from someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time. Years ago, I would have ignored it and sent a message later. That night, I answered. We talked for a long time about life, about work, about missed connections. There were pauses, laughter, repetition. Nothing was polished, everything was real. When the call ended, I felt grounded, present. I thought about how many conversations like that I had missed because of fear, and instead of sadness, I felt gratitude. Gratitude that I had learned to answer when it mattered. The final insight of this journey became clear to me then. Confidence is not loud, it is reliable. People trust those who show up, even imperfectly. That reliability had nothing to do with accent or grammar. It came from willingness, from answering instead of avoiding, from choosing connection over comfort. The phone had once been a symbol of everything I feared. Now it was simply an object, a tool, something I used when needed. The fear did not disappear, but it no longer defined me. One last moment remained, a quiet conclusion, the kind that does not announce itself but stays with you afterward. The moment where I finally understood what this journey was really about. Segment 8. Narrator Daniel. The end of this story does not arrive with a victory call or a dramatic transformation. It arrives in a quiet realization, the kind that changes how you move through the world without asking for attention. One morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee. An unknown number. No warning, no preparation. I glanced at the screen and noticed something different. My body did not freeze. The old fear appeared for a moment, familiar but weak. It no longer commanded my hands or my breath. I answered naturally, without thinking about what might go wrong. The conversation was short, practical, ordinary. When it ended, I returned to my coffee without replaying the call in my head, without analyzing my accent, without measuring my performance. That was when I understood the journey was complete. Not because I had mastered phone calls, not because my English became flawless, but because fear no longer decided how I participated in my life. For years, I believed phone calls were about English ability, vocabulary, speed, pronunciation, but they were never about language. They were about permission, permission to take up space, permission to ask for clarity, permission to sound human. Avoidance had once felt like control. In reality, it had narrowed my world. Every missed call was a conversation I never had, a connection that never formed, an opportunity that quietly passed by. Answering calls did not make me fearless. It made me present. Presence is what turns language into communication. I thought about the person I used to be, the one who watched the phone ring and hoped it would stop, the one who told himself he would call back later, the one who believed silence was safer than misunderstanding. That version of me was not weak. He was careful. He survived with the tools he had, and those tools were enough until they weren't. Growth does not erase fear. It teaches you how to walk with it. My accent did not disappear. My nervousness did not vanish completely. But my willingness to engage changed everything. I began noticing how many people around me carry the same fear quietly. People who avoided calls, people who preferred silence, people who apologized before speaking, and I saw myself in them. When I spoke calmly, when I listened patiently, when I made space, something happened. Fear softened. That is the quiet power of showing up. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, I want you to understand something clearly. You do not need perfect English to answer the phone. You do not need confidence to begin. You do not need to wait until fear disappears. You only need willingness. Every call you answer teaches your body that nothing terrible happens. Every conversation you stay in teaches your mind that misunderstanding is not failure. It is part of connection. Language is not about sounding right. It is about being there. One day you will answer a call without thinking about it. And when you notice that moment, you will realize how far you have come. Not because the fear is gone, but because it no longer controls you. That is when you know you are fluent enough to live. Subscribe now, join the Bright World English Academy family, and let's start your English learning journey together.